New developments tonight in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, the 84-year-old mother of Today Show host Savannah Guthrie. Late today, the sheriff saying all family members have been cleared in her disappearance, aware of the online chatter and speculation surrounding this case.
There are moments in life that strip away everything polished and carefully constructed. Moments that demand you show up not as the person the world expects you to be, but as the person you actually are. For Hoda Kotb, one of the most recognized and beloved faces in American morning television, that moment arrived in the winter of 2026, and it arrived not because of anything happening in her own life, but because of a crisis unfolding in the life of someone she loves like a sister. What Hoda did next, and what she said when she finally opened up about it, revealed something far deeper than what most people expected from a woman who had, just months earlier, stepped away from the spotlight entirely. At 61 years old, Hoda Kotb is no longer trying to be everything to everyone. But when Savannah Guthrie needed someone, Hoda proved that real friendship doesn't check the clock and doesn't ask whether the timing is convenient. To understand why Hoda's return to the Today Show in February 2026 meant so much, you have to understand what she walked away from in the first place. Hoda Kotb spent more than 2.5 decades at NBC, building a career that most journalists would consider the pinnacle of the profession. She sat at the most famous morning news desk in the country, reached tens of millions of viewers every single day, and became one of the most trusted voices in American homes. But in the summer of 2024, when she turned 60, something shifted inside her. She began looking at her life differently. She began asking herself whether the career she had built was still the life she actually wanted to be living. And when she looked around and saw her two daughters, Haley and Hope, growing up so fast, the answer became clear. She announced her departure from the Today Show in September of 2024, and her final broadcast on January 10, 2025 was a celebration that filled the larger studio at 30 Rockefeller Plaza with fans, colleagues, and the people she loved most. After she left, Hoda built a quieter life in Westchester. She started a wellness company, worked on a new app, attended PTA meetings, and walked through her neighborhood with other mothers. She was present for bedtimes and breakfasts. Her youngest daughter, Hope, had faced serious health challenges, and Hoda wanted to be there for every single moment of her recovery and her childhood. By most measures, Hoda had made a clean and intentional break. She had done the hard thing that very few people at the top of their careers are brave enough to do. She had walked away while she was still at the height of her powers, on her own terms, for reasons that had nothing to do with failure and everything to do with love. But then February 2026 arrived, and the world Hoda had so carefully constructed was interrupted by a phone call that no friend ever wants to receive. The disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, Savannah's 84-year-old mother, shook the Today Show and its audience to the core. Nancy had lived independently in Tucson, Arizona for decades. She was known for her sharp mind, her deep faith, and the kind of iron-willed strength that she had passed down to her children through example rather than instruction. On the night of January 31, 2026, Nancy had dinner with family, was dropped at her home, and by the following morning she was simply gone. There were signs of a struggle. A doorbell camera at the property had been disconnected in the early hours of the morning. Blood was found on the porch. And within days, a ransom demand arrived, cold and calculated, written like a business transaction and demanding millions of dollars in cryptocurrency. The nightmare was real and it was escalating. Savannah left the Today Show immediately to fly to Arizona, where she worked closely with the FBI and local law enforcement, acting not as a journalist covering a story but as a terrified daughter trying to bring her mother home. The anchor chair she left behind was more than a professional vacancy. It was a symbol of a wound that the entire Today Show family was feeling in real time. Hoda didn't hesitate. On February 9, 2026, she walked back into Studio 1A and sat down in her old chair. She had not been asked to return as a guest appearance or a one-time fill-in. She came back as an anchor, fully present, ready to carry the weight of the show while her friend carried a different kind of weight 1,500 miles away. She gave up her quiet mornings in Westchester. She gave up sleeping past 4 a.m. She gave up the Italy trip she and Savannah had both been scheduled to take to cover the 2026 Winter Olympics. She traded all of it without a second thought because, as she later explained to her viewers, this was never really a choice. When someone you love is drowning, you don't calculate the cost of jumping in. You just jump. What Hoda said on the air during those early days back told the whole story without her having to spell it out. She spoke about the moment her daughter Hope had been rushed to the hospital in 2023, a terrifying time in her own life when she had felt completely alone in the way that only a parent in a medical crisis can feel. She told her audience that when she looked up from her fear that day, the first face she saw walking through the door was Savannah's. Not a colleague. Not a coworker. Savannah. Her friend had shown up without being asked, without waiting to see how serious it was, without measuring whether it was convenient. That single act of showing up was the foundation of everything Hoda did in February 2026. She was simply returning what had already been given to her. The way Hoda handled herself on air during those weeks was a masterclass in something that television rarely gets right, which is the balance between professional responsibility and genuine human emotion. She didn't collapse into sentimentality or turn the broadcast into a tearful vigil. She kept the audience informed. She reported the details as they emerged, the forensic evidence, the ransom negotiations, the FBI's digital investigation. She wore a small yellow ribbon on her jacket, and within minutes of her wearing it the first time, every person on that set was wearing one too, not because they were told to but because they understood what she was doing and they wanted to be part of it. The yellow ribbon became a symbol of something larger than a news story. It became a national expression of solidarity, and within days people across the country were tying yellow fabric to trees in their front yards, handing out yellow flowers in Tucson, and flooding social media with images of a country that had not forgotten Nancy Guthrie. But there was another dimension to what Hoda was doing that didn't happen under the studio lights. On her personal Instagram, in the late hours after her daughters were asleep, Hoda was conducting what could only be described as a digital vigil. She posted photographs of Savannah and Nancy together, not press images or publicity shots, but the kind of personal, unguarded photos that live in family albums. Photos of laughter and ordinary moments. Photos of a mother and a daughter just being alive together. By sharing these images, Hoda was doing something deliberate and deeply strategic. She was keeping Nancy Guthrie visible not as a news story but as a human being, a grandmother, a woman of faith, a mother who had raised her children through grief and hardship and come out on the other side. The more real Nancy felt to the public, the harder it would be for the story to fade into the background noise of the 24-hour news cycle. Hoda also used her platform to urge people to keep sharing, keep calling in tips, and keep believing that Nancy could be found. She understood intuitively that attention is a form of pressure, and that kidnappers and criminals generally hate nothing more than a searchlight that refuses to move. She was using every tool available to her not for ratings or relevance but for the singular purpose of bringing an 84-year-old woman home to her family. Through all of this, Hoda was also watching Savannah closely, and what she saw worried her in a way that went beyond the crisis itself. Savannah Guthrie is one of the most disciplined, controlled, and professionally accomplished people in American media. She trained as a lawyer before she became a journalist, and that legal mind of hers means she approaches almost everything with structure, logic, and an almost unnerving composure. Nancy Guthrie raised her children to be strong. Not the performative kind of strong that cracks under pressure, but the deep-rooted, almost stubborn variety of strength that treats vulnerability as a luxury you can't afford. That code had served Savannah extraordinarily well throughout her career. But Hoda could see that in the middle of this crisis, that same code was becoming something else entirely. It was becoming a cage. Savannah was managing everything simultaneously. She was coordinating with the FBI, communicating with local law enforcement, supporting her siblings, maintaining a public presence that kept the pressure on investigators, and all the while trying to be present for her own two young children who were watching their mother carry an impossible weight. She was reporting on her own family's nightmare with the same controlled precision she would bring to covering a Senate hearing. And to most people watching from the outside, she looked remarkably calm. But Hoda knew better. She had spent enough mornings sitting next to Savannah to read the micro-expressions, the tiny tells, the things that never make it to camera. Behind those steady eyes was a daughter who was terrified that if she finally let herself break down, she would somehow be failing the very woman she was trying to save. In private conversations between New York and Arizona, Hoda did something that only the truest kind of friend can do. She didn't offer strategy or advice or action plans. She simply told Savannah to breathe. She reminded her that being human in a crisis is not the same thing as being weak. That falling apart a little doesn't mean you've failed. That even iron bends under enough heat, and that needing help is not a character flaw but a fundamental feature of being alive. Hoda, at 61, has earned the kind of perspective that only comes through loss and transition and the particular clarity that arrives when you stop trying to be impressive and start trying to be real. She knew that no public image, no professional reputation, no legacy built over decades on a morning show is worth sacrificing your mental and emotional health. She had made her own version of that choice when she walked off the set in January 2025, and now she was gently offering that same wisdom to her friend. What this entire episode has revealed about Hoda Kotb is something that her audience always suspected but rarely got to see so plainly. She is not performing warmth. It is not a TV persona carefully constructed over years of morning programming. The woman who came back to Studio 1A in February 2026, who wore the yellow ribbon and posted the late-night Instagram tributes and called her friend in Arizona just to tell her to breathe, is the same woman who has been showing up in her own life with that same quality of presence for decades. The difference is that this time the whole country got to watch. There is something worth sitting with in the image of Hoda Kotb at 61, a woman who had just finished reinventing her life on her own terms, choosing to set all of that aside and step back into the most demanding job she had ever held, not for money, not for fame, not because she missed the camera, but because a friend needed her. In a media landscape that sometimes feels more transactional than human, where loyalty is often conditional and friendship is sometimes just networking with better lighting, that kind of choice stands out. It is not complicated or strategic. It is simply what you do when you love someone. Savannah Guthrie is one of the toughest, sharpest, most capable people in broadcasting. But even the toughest people need someone in their corner who isn't keeping score. Someone who shows up not because it's part of the job description but because it's part of who they are. Hoda Kotb is that person for Savannah. And in speaking openly about why she came back, about what Savannah means to her, about the hospital visit in 2023 and the promise that friendship carries forward, Hoda did something quietly radical. She modeled what it actually looks like to prioritize people over careers, connection over convenience, and love over everything else. At 61, Hoda Kotb has nothing left to prove to the television industry. Her resume is complete. Her legacy is cemented. She could have stayed in Westchester indefinitely and no one would have blamed her for a single morning of it. But she didn't stay because the measure of who we are isn't what we do when everything is going well. It's what we do at 4 o'clock in the morning when a friend is scared and the world is watching and someone needs to hold the line. Hoda held the line. And in doing so, she reminded all of us what it looks like when friendship is not just a word but a practice, lived out in real time with real stakes, and a real yellow ribbon pinned to a jacket on the most famous morning news desk in America.